Last year, they counted at least 993 executions. That's 4% fewer than in 2016 and 39% fewer than in 2015.
Around the world, death row isn't just about waiting. It's a prison filled with terror and the kind of fear that's hard to even imagine. It's a place where time seems to stop, and every tick of the clock brings you closer to the end. In some places, like certain prisons in the United States, inmates suffer through horrific botched executions. In Saudi Arabia, they face stoning, while in North Korea, they're executed by firing squad. In this video, you'll discover the chilling realities of living in constant fear of death while on death row. So, strap in. These stories are as spine-chilling as they are eye-opening. Let's dive in. Death flights in the 90s. In Argentina, during the 1990s, death row became a place of unimaginable horror. The reason behind this will leave you shocked. During the Dirty War, many prisoners on death row met a brutal fate through something called death flights. The practice was used by the military dictatorship to eliminate political opponents, and the details are beyond belief. Prisoners were often drugged, with officials pretending to transfer them to a different facility. But instead, they were flown out in planes, only to be thrown into the Atlantic Ocean from thousands of feet above. The victims were usually political activists, journalists, and anyone labeled as a threat to the regime. Whistleblowers later claimed that many of those targeted were from left-wing groups like the Monteros or the People's Revolutionary Army. The campaign was also said to include anyone who dared to oppose the dictatorship. The military's goal was to wipe out any trace of their crimes, and an estimated 30,000 lives were lost in the process. Thankfully, these death flights didn't go unnoticed. In 2017, several military officials were convicted of crimes against humanity, with some being handed life sentences. One of the convicted was former naval officer Adolfo Shingo, who confessed to throwing 30 left-wing prisoners out of planes at 4,000 meters above the ocean. He described how prisoners were sedated and led to their deaths, believing they were being taken to safety. He was eventually sentenced to a staggering 640 years in prison by a Spanish court. Shingo became the first Argentinian military officer jailed by a foreign court for crimes against humanity. While these death flights were deliberate and horrific, not all executions go according to plan. A botched execution. In 2014, in the United States, Clayton Lockett's execution turned into a nightmare. It wasn't just the fact that he was put to death that raised eyebrows. It was what happened during the process. Lockett had been arrested in 1999 for the murder of 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman, who had just graduated from high school 2 weeks earlier. Along with two accomplices, Lockett had brutally attacked one of Neiman's friends and molested another. Lockett allegedly told Neiman several times that he would kill her if she didn't promise to stay quiet. But despite his threats, Neiman refused to back down, insisting she'd go to the police. Tragically, before she could do that, Lockett pulled out a gun and shot her twice. He and his accomplices then buried her in a shallow grave while she was still alive. 15 years later, Lockett faced one of the most horrific executions ever recorded. He was sentenced to die by lethal injection, but things went horribly wrong. The IV that was meant to administer the lethal drugs was placed incorrectly, causing him to die from a heart attack. Court filings revealed that Lockett was pricked at least 16 times in attempts to get the IV in place. The proper needle was unavailable, so the doctor used a smaller 1.2 5-inch needle instead of the usual 2 to 2.25-inch one, and tried inserting it into Lockett's femoral vein. A witness to the execution described how Lockett groaned and twisted in pain as the lethal drugs were administered, and it took 43 minutes for him to finally die. A similar, though chaotic, situation happened in Serbia back in 1947, when individuals seen as war criminals or political enemies were executed by members of the Yugoslav partisan movement. These executions weren't planned, but were rather carried out as part of a chaotic post-war vendetta. But while some death row incidents were unintentional, others were carried out with cold, calculated purpose. One of the most brutal methods of execution is electrocution, a shocking and painful process that involves passing a high-voltage electric current through an inmate's body. It's one of the most widely used forms of execution in the U.S., and typically involves electrodes attached to the head and legs of the condemned person, who was strapped to a chair. One infamous example is the 1953 execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were convicted of espionage. On June 19, 1953, the Rosenbergs were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison in New York after being accused of passing U.S. atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. They became the first U.S. citizens to be executed for espionage during peacetime. Julius had been arrested in 1950 for allegedly leading a spy ring that gave the Soviets top-secret information about the atomic bomb. Ethel was arrested 2 months later, and after a short trial, they were both convicted. Despite the trial and mounting controversy, the couple maintained their innocence all the way to the end. In 1990, however, Jesse Taro's execution was anything but ordinary. Instead of the usual procedure, he experienced unimaginable suffering when the electric chair malfunctioned. It was reported that the chair failed 3 times, causing flames to leap from his head. While many death row cases focus on the physical pain inflicted on inmates, this next one is all about the torment they experience mentally. Death row isolation. In Japan, death row inmates live in almost complete isolation, sometimes for decades, and without any prior warning of their execution date. In these countries, death row inmates endure harsh, psychologically draining conditions, often for long stretches of time. They're usually kept in solitary confinement, with little to no interaction with others, and minimal access to sunlight or fresh air. This extreme isolation can wreak havoc on their mental health. One of the most controversial parts of Japan's death penalty system is the fact that inmates often aren't told when their execution will take place. They usually only find out a few hours before, denying them the chance to mentally prepare for their death, say goodbye to their loved ones, or make any final legal challenges. The Japanese government defends this practice, saying it's necessary to maintain order and prevent suicides, but critics argue it's cruel and inhumane. Inmates live in constant fear, knowing that any day could be their last. A similar practice happens in China. In 2012, a talk show called Interviews Before Execution revealed how prisoners in China are often executed just 7 days after being sentenced. The show gave condemned inmates a platform to share their stories before their execution, offering a rare glimpse into the lives of those on death row. In India, while most prisoners sentenced to death end up with their sentences commuted to life imprisonment, there are still those who face the death penalty. Once their sentence is confirmed, these inmates are placed under a different prison regime. While executions are supposed to take place shortly after sentencing, some prisoners end up spending years on death row. In 1983, the Indian Supreme Court ruled that no inmate should be left on death row for more than 2 years. But this ruling hasn't always been followed. In 2014, a 14-day waiting period was introduced before executions to give inmates a chance to spend time with their families. However, this law hasn't always been respected. For instance, in 2015, Yaqub Memon, a terrorist financier, was hanged just hours after the Supreme Court rejected his final mercy petition, sparking widespread criticism. In India, people have criticized the quickness of executions, and Zambia has a similar issue. In Zambia, prisoners sentenced to death often stay on death row for decades because the government is hesitant to sign execution warrants. The long wait has sparked lots of controversy. But there's one particular death row experience that's been even more heavily criticized: firing squad executions. In 2022, North Korea publicly executed 3 teenagers by firing squad. 2 of them were punished for watching and distributing South Korean movies, and 1 was executed for killing his stepmother. The authorities described their crimes as evil and insisted that anyone guilty of these offenses would not be forgiven, facing the maximum penalty: death. Witnesses who saw the execution described it as terrifying. While executions like this are rare in North Korea, they are not unheard of, and some say the government uses them to scare the public into compliance. Similar to North Korea, the US has had its own history with firing squad executions. Utah, in particular, is one of only 2 states to carry out executions by firing squad. It's the only one to have done so since the end of the 1972 to 1976 national moratorium on capital punishment. A well-known case is the execution of Ronnie Lee Gardner in 2010. Gardner had been sentenced to death for killing a man during an escape attempt from a courthouse in 2010-1985. In 1984, Gardner had killed Melvin John Otterstrom in a robbery, and during his court hearing in 1985, he shot and killed attorney Michael Burdell while trying to escape. Despite evidence showing that Gardner had a troubled upbringing, his appeals were denied, and his requests for a lighter sentence were rejected. He was executed by firing squad in Utah in 2010. While death sentences in Utah and North Korea were brutal, inmates there at least knew what was coming. In Myanmar, however, prisoners face even worse before they die: intense torture. Since Myanmar's military coup in 2021, the country has severely restricted civil freedoms, leading to widespread oppression. Reports say thousands of activists, protesters, and political dissidents have been arrested on false charges like terrorism and sedition. Many face secret military tribunals, unfair trials, and harsh punishments, including the death penalty. But before they even reach death, many inmates undergo brutal torture. Even more disturbing, reports say that prisoners often receive inadequate medical care, leading to deaths in custody. In 2023 alone, 34 political prisoners died in Myanmar's jails, with 18 killed in detention and 16 dying due to lack of treatment. Torture is becoming more common for those awaiting execution. Reports of torture, lack of medical care, and even deaths in custody have made many question what inmates on death row in Myanmar are really going through. In 2023 alone, 34 political prisoners lost their lives in Myanmar's prisons. Human rights groups report that 18 were killed inside detention centers, and 16 died because they didn't get the medical treatment they needed. Torture has also become more common since the coup, with some prisoners even dying during transfers between facilities under accusations of trying to escape. One heartbreaking case is that of 29-year-old former rapper and singer San Lin San. After the coup, San gave up his music career to join anti-regime activities, eventually becoming a member of the Black Dragon Force, a rebel group accused of killing regime-appointed local officials. He was arrested in September 2023, sentenced to death the next month, and transferred to a prison in Pathan. While in detention, San developed a severe medical condition caused by torture during interrogation. According to a family friend, he needed surgery to treat a buildup of cerebrospinal fluid in his brain. Unfortunately, despite his worsening health, San was denied proper medical care, and this led to his death. While inmates in Myanmar face intense torture, those in Thailand also endure significant pain, particularly from lethal injections. In 2003, Thailand switched from firing squads to lethal injections for executions. Since then, there have been several incidents involving this method. One such case occurred in 2014 when Edgar Tamayo, a Mexican national, was executed for the 1994 killing of a police officer named Gaddis. Tamayo had shot the officer outside a nightclub after he was caught robbing someone. Although the Mexican government was notified of Tamayo's case just before the trial, their appeals for clemency were rejected, and he was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. A similar case in Thailand involved Therasak Longji, a convicted murderer who was executed for the robbery and brutal murder of a 17-year-old boy. Longji allegedly stabbed his victim 24 times. He became the first person to be executed in Thailand since 2009, and the 7th person to be executed by lethal injection since the country switched from firing squads to this method. While most death row incidents like lethal injections happen within prison walls, this next incident took place in the open, public hanging in Saudi Arabia. Crimes such as drug trafficking or political dissent are often punished by public executions in Saudi Arabia. As of September 2024, Saudi authorities have executed over 198 individuals, marking the highest number of executions in the country since 1990. Despite repeated promises to limit the use of the death penalty, Saudi authorities have only increased executions, often failing to meet international standards for fair trials. One example of public execution is the case of Mia Qasim Ali, a senior leader of the Jamaat Islami Party. Ali, a former top businessman, was convicted of war crimes during Bangladesh's 1971 War of Independence. After being sentenced to death, his appeal was dismissed by Bangladesh's top court, leaving him with the option to seek clemency, which he refused. The authorities prepared for his execution, and he was eventually hanged for crimes he allegedly committed years earlier. A similar situation occurred with Iraqi politician and revolutionary Saddam Hussein. He was convicted of crimes against humanity, specifically for the massacre of 148 Iraqi Shiites in the town of Dujail in 1982. Despite being sentenced to death by an Iraqi court, Saddam requested to be executed by firing squad rather than hanging, arguing that hanging was not the lawful military capital punishment. His request was denied, and on December 30th, 2006, Saddam was executed by hanging. The Iraqi government later released an official video of his execution, showing his walk to the gallows and the placement of the noose around his neck. While Saddam Hussein and the other individuals mentioned were executed individually, a different scenario occurred in the form of mass executions. In 1988, thousands of political prisoners were secretly executed in Iran. Reports say the massacre, which began on July 19, 1988, lasted 5 months and involved a series of mass executions of Iranian political prisoners. These executions, which took place in at least 32 cities, were allegedly ordered by Iranian Islamic revolutionary Ayatollah Khomeini and carried out by Iranian officials. The trials were not focused on determining the guilt or innocence of the defendants and were carried out without legislative basis. While the exact number of those killed remains uncertain, human rights organizations estimate that up to 5,000 people were executed. Some estimates, such as from Human Rights Watch, place the number between 2,800 and 30,000, while Amnesty International and the United Nations Human Rights Council estimate at least 30,000 individuals were killed. Saudi Arabia's government also announced the mass execution of 37 men in various parts of the country. Reports indicated that at least 33 of the 37 victims were from the country's minority Shia community and had been convicted following unfair trials for a range of alleged crimes, including protest-related offenses, espionage, and terrorism. This wasn't the only time Saudi Arabia has carried out such executions. In 2016, 47 men were executed in the country for terrorism offenses, and by the end of 2019, over 100 people had already been publicly executed. Mass executions like these have received widespread condemnation internationally. This next death row incident, execution by stoning, has also been globally criticized. Execution by stoning is a common practice in Islamic countries that adhere to Sharia law, specifically under the hudud punishments. This method involves an organized group throwing stones at a convicted individual until they die. Despite under certain interpretations of Sharia law, stoning is often used as a punishment for adultery committed by a married person. In Afghanistan, under Taliban rule, women accused of adultery are often subjected to execution by stoning without proper legal proceedings. Earlier this year, Hibatullah Akhundzada, the Taliban's supreme leader, issued an audio message stating that women would be flogged and stoned to death in public for crimes. Akhundzada reaffirmed the group's stance on public floggings and stoning, adding that while other societies may view this as a violation of women's rights, the Taliban intends to continue this practice. While stoning executions have mainly been used on women, this next method was applied to both men and women. Guillotine executions. Before abolishing the death penalty in 1981, France used the guillotine as a method of execution. Introduced in 1792, the guillotine was conceived as a humane and efficient method of execution. Prior to this, executions in France were often brutal and inconsistent, involving methods like hanging, burning, or breaking on the wheel. The guillotine, however, was designed to provide a quick, painless death for all individuals, regardless of social class. The execution device consisted of a tall wooden frame with a heavy angled blade suspended at the top. The condemned individual's head was placed in a groove on the base, and the blade was released to fall rapidly, severing the head instantly. A notable example of this method was the execution of Hamida Jandoubi, the last person to be executed by guillotine. Jandoubi, a Tunisian immigrant living in Marseille, was executed in 1977 for the torture and murder of his girlfriend. Jandoubi allegedly killed her in retaliation after she reported to authorities that he had attempted to force her into prostitution. He was sentenced to death in February 1977 and executed by guillotine in September of that year. In Saudi Arabia, a similar method of execution is employed: beheading. Public beheadings, often carried out for drug offenses, have been widely reported. The surge in executions in Saudi Arabia has raised alarms, drawing international condemnation. In late 2022, Saudi authorities executed 12 people within 10 days for drug offenses, including citizens from countries like Pakistan, Syria, and Jordan. Many of these individuals were allegedly sentenced to death under controversial circumstances, such as confessions obtained through alleged torture. In some cases, the families of the accused were not even notified before the execution. In 2019, 5 bodies were reportedly crucified after being beheaded. These men, all Yemeni nationals, were beheaded and crucified in the city of Jizan, while another Saudi Arabian man was executed in the southwestern city of Abha. Photographs from the scene showed 5 decapitated bodies hanging from a horizontal pole, their heads wrapped in bags. The beheadings and crucifixions reportedly took place in front of the University of Jizan, where students were taking exams. Similar to beheading, this next death row incident is particularly shocking: purge by anti-aircraft gun. This method is commonly used in North Korea, where it has been reported that senior officials who were deemed a threat to Kim Jong-un's leadership were executed this way. For instance, in 2016, officials such as Hang Min, a former agriculture minister, and Ri Yong-jin, a senior official at the Education Ministry, were reportedly executed using anti-aircraft guns at a military academy in Pyongyang. Hang was allegedly killed for making policy proposals that were seen as a direct threat to Kim's leadership, while Ri was said to have been executed for falling asleep during a meeting chaired by Kim Jong-un. A similar incident occurred in 2015 when North Korea executed its defense chief, Hyeon Yong-chol, by anti-aircraft gun at a firing range. Hyeon, who headed the country's military, was charged with treason, including disobeying Kim Jong-un and falling asleep during an event in Kim's presence. It was reported that Kim Jong-un had ordered the execution of 15 senior officials before Hyeon, as punishment for challenging his authority. While many of these executions are carried out by authorities, there have also been reports of unusual behavior by inmates on death row. One of the most famous examples of such behavior is that of Thomas Grasso, who was executed in 1995. Grasso requested a last meal consisting of 24 steamed mussels, a Burger King double cheeseburger, and a slice of pumpkin pie with whipped cream. However, due to the prison's inability to provide the necessary ingredients, none of his requested food was served. In addition to unusual meal requests, some inmates make strange or memorable final statements, asserting their innocence or expressing love and affection for their families.
A series of 8-year-old photographs is currently making the rounds on the internet in China. As Celia Hatton tells us, despite their age, the death row images are shedding new light on a country that executes far more people than any other country in the world.
Let's take a look at China first, where the death penalty has been notoriously secretive. China is known for its high number of executions, but the government refuses to release official statistics, and what little information gets out is often inconsistent. In fact, Amnesty International's 2014 report
welcome to this briefing by Amnesty International. Reflects the urgency for China to reform its death penalty.
Pointed out that the country's practice of executing individuals is kept under a shroud of secrecy, with no public details or even official confirmation of when these executions take place. One of the methods China uses is firing squads, though lethal injection is also becoming more common. But what makes the firing squad so disturbing is its brutal finality. In some cases, prisoners are shot in the back of the head, a method designed for efficiency, but one that leaves little dignity. There's no public record of the number of people executed by firing squad each year, which means families don't even get a chance to grieve properly. It's the kind of cold, impersonal act that makes death feel less like a legal decision and more like an execution without humanity. Another disturbing aspect of China's execution practices is the use of foreign nationals as part of the grim statistic.
A death sentence for a 53-year-old British man has been carried out, marking the first time in 50 years that a European has been executed in China. Akmal Sheikh had been convicted of drug trafficking, but his family says he was the victim of a criminal gang.
People from different countries, who are often caught in politically sensitive situations or entangled in the country's strict anti-drug laws, find themselves facing a death sentence with little chance of survival. For example, in 2014, an Australian national, Andrew Chan, was arrested for drug trafficking in China, only to be sentenced to death by firing squad. The secrecy surrounding his case kept his family in the dark, not knowing when or how his execution would unfold. But China isn't the only Asian country with a chilling death penalty history. Vietnam, like many Southeast Asian nations, has been involved in the execution of criminals in the most secretive of circumstances.
In other news, a court in Vietnam has sentenced 27 people to death for drug trafficking. According to reports, the court found them guilty of trafficking more than 600 kilos of narcotics from Cambodia into Vietnam.
Vietnam executes a wide range of people, from drug offenders to those convicted of violent crimes. But it's the lack of transparency that makes the situation even more horrific. Executions often happen in the dead of night, with no prior announcement to the public, and families often find out after the fact. One case that stuck out was that of Nguyen Duc Hoang, a Vietnamese man sentenced to death in 2016. He was convicted of drug trafficking, a crime punishable by death in Vietnam. However, his family wasn't notified of his execution until after it had taken place. This secrecy robs not just the individual of their dignity, but their loved ones of the opportunity to say goodbye or seek justice. The Vietnamese government has been known for keeping death row cases under wraps, preventing the media from reporting on the actual events surrounding executions. As horrifying as the secrecy is, there's something even more unsettling about the psychological toll that death row inmates face. Imagine being on death row, knowing that your execution could happen at any time, but you aren't told when. That's the nightmare that many prisoners in Japan live through. Japan's method of execution is hanging, and it's carried out with such secrecy that many inmates are never informed of their execution date until the very last minute. In Japan, death row inmates live in a state of constant uncertainty. They're placed in solitary confinement, and the exact timing of their execution is a mystery. In some cases, the condemned are told about their fate just hours before they are hanged. It's a psychological torment that's impossible to imagine, living day after day, not knowing if today will be the day that your life ends. And when the day comes, it's not announced to the public beforehand, and often, the families aren't informed until after the execution.
The case of Iwa Hakamada shining a spotlight on the Japanese justice system. Now 78, the former boxing champion confessed to killing a family of 4.
The case of Hakamada Iwao illustrates just how brutal Japan's death penalty system can be. Hakamada was wrongfully imprisoned for 48 years on death row before he was exonerated in 2014. Imagine spending nearly 5 decades in solitary confinement, knowing only that your life could be snuffed out at any time. It's a haunting reality that shows how Japan's system doesn't just punish the condemned. It destroys them mentally long before the execution. The death penalty in Asia isn't just about punishing those who commit heinous crimes. It's deeply political, often used as a weapon of control, intimidation, and fear. Governments in some Asian countries don't just use capital punishment to deal with criminals. They use it to send a message. It's a display of power, a public demonstration that those who challenge the state or violate its laws will pay the ultimate price. In some places, it's almost like a game of politics, where human lives are used as pawns to manipulate public perception and bolster the government's image. Take Indonesia, for example. This Southeast Asian nation has been notorious for its stance on the death penalty, particularly when it comes to drug trafficking.
I have breaking news right now, so I want to ask your reaction on this breaking news. Mary Jane Veloso, the Filipino OFW, is coming home to the Philippines after being arrested for drug trafficking in Indonesia.
In 2015, Indonesia made global headlines when it executed 10 drug offenders, including foreign nationals, by firing squad. Among them was Mary Jane Veloso, a Filipino woman who had been sentenced to death for attempting to smuggle heroin into the country. Despite widespread pleas for clemency from around the world, Indonesian President Joko Widodo made it clear that the country's strict anti-drug stance would not be compromised. He even warned that Indonesia would continue executing drug offenders without hesitation. The firing squad method used in Indonesia is both brutal and public, designed to make a statement about the government's determination to fight drug-related crime. But what's even more chilling is the way these executions are carried out. In many cases, the prisoners are told the night before their execution, and they are given no opportunity to say goodbye to their families. While the government claims these executions are necessary for national security, critics argue that they do little to curb drug use or trafficking. In fact, some studies have shown that executions do nothing to reduce the number of drug-related crimes, making one wonder whether these public executions are more about maintaining political power than achieving any meaningful social good. The Indonesian government's use of the death penalty is a prime example of how the state can use capital punishment as a political tool to unite the nation against a common enemy, whether real or imagined. In 2015, the country even executed 2 Australian nationals, Andrew Chan and Mayuran Sukumaran, for their involvement in a drug trafficking ring, further demonstrating how death row can be used as a bargaining chip on the international stage. The execution sparked outrage in Australia, but the Indonesian government showed no signs of backing down, making it clear that the death penalty was a key part of their political agenda. But Indonesia isn't the only country in Asia that uses executions for political purposes. In countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, the death penalty often carries a heavy political undertone. These countries have a long history of using executions not just to punish criminals, but to reinforce their political authority. In fact, the Singaporean government has long maintained that capital punishment is a necessary deterrent for drug crimes, even though there's little evidence to support its effectiveness. One of the most controversial methods used in Singapore is hanging, which has been the standard form of execution for decades. The practice is swift, but it's also a chilling reminder of the country's hardline stance on crime. In 2015, Singapore executed Koh Jabing, a Malaysian national, for a murder conviction. Despite pleas for clemency from international organizations and even Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, Singapore proceeded with the execution. The fact that Singapore's government could dismiss international calls for mercy underscores the deep political role that executions play in maintaining the country's strict laws and public image. While Singapore's method of hanging is relatively quick compared to some other methods, it still serves the purpose of instilling fear in the public. Imagine being caught in a legal system where your life can be taken away for a crime that, in some cases, might have been committed in a moment of desperation. For many, the sheer swiftness of the execution process makes it all the more terrifying. It's not just about the crime, it's about the power of the state to take control of your life. But beyond the borders of Southeast Asia, there's another country that brings execution to the next level of political theater: North Korea. The secretive and brutal regime in Pyongyang has long used executions as a tool to eliminate political rivals and suppress dissent. Many of these executions are carried out in private, often without the condemned ever being publicly named. The method of execution? Firing squad is common, as well as execution by anti-aircraft gun. It's a chilling display of power, one designed to keep the population in line through fear and intimidation. North Korea's political purges are infamous, with high-ranking officials being executed for even the slightest perceived betrayal or disloyalty to the regime. For example, in 2013, Jang Song-thaek, the uncle of Kim Jong-un, was executed by firing squad after being accused of treason and plotting a coup. His execution, carried out in front of high-ranking officials, sent a clear message to anyone thinking of challenging the regime. In a country where death is often the result of political disagreements, execution becomes a tool to maintain absolute control over the population. The sheer scale of political executions in North Korea, many of which are carried out without any kind of legal process or transparency, reveals the terrifying extent to which death row can be weaponized for political purposes. And with methods as extreme as anti-aircraft guns and firing squads, it's clear that these executions are meant to instill terror in both the public and any potential dissenters. The death penalty isn't just a physical act, it's a psychological one too. For those languishing on death row, the waiting itself becomes a form of torture. The uncertainty of when their final day will arrive, the isolation from the outside world, and the psychological toll of knowing their life could end at any moment can break a person. But it's not just the waiting, it's also the brutal methods used to carry out these executions that leave a permanent mark on the condemned. In Thailand, the use of lethal injection began in 2003, but the method hasn't been widely used due to complications in finding the necessary drugs. Much like in China, Thailand's authorities have occasionally faced difficulties acquiring the drugs needed for executions. This has led to a backlog of prisoners on death row, awaiting their fate, in a system that already makes a profound psychological impact on the condemned. The toll of being held in limbo, waiting for an uncertain future, is a fate in itself. It's no surprise that many human rights advocates argue that keeping people on death row for years, sometimes even decades, causes irreversible harm, far before the actual method of execution even comes into play. But one of the most unsettling parts of Asia's death penalty practices is how governments continue to use the threat of execution as a tool of political control. The death penalty has become more than just a way to punish crime. It's used to silence political dissent, to quash opposition, and to remind the population of the absolute power of the state. Whether it's North Korea's grotesque execution by anti-aircraft gun or the state-sponsored purges in China, the message is clear. There is no room for opposition. The fear of death is enough to keep many people in line, both physically and psychologically. As the international community grows louder in its calls for the abolition of the death penalty, there's hope that some countries in Asia will take steps to end this brutal practice. While nations like Japan and Singapore maintain their hardline stance on capital punishment, others, such as Nepal and Mongolia, have taken bold steps toward abolition. In recent years, the number of executions has declined in some Asian countries, which could signal a shift toward more progressive attitudes toward justice. However, the road to abolition is still a long one. It's hard to predict whether countries like China, Indonesia, or North Korea will ever abandon the death penalty, given how intertwined it is with political power and control. But what is clear is that there's growing resistance to these brutal practices. People are beginning to see that the death penalty is not a solution to crime, but a human rights violation that perpetuates cycles of violence, suffering, and fear. In the end, what's truly horrifying about the death penalty in Asia is not just the methods used, but the system that keeps people living in fear, uncertainty, and isolation. It is said that every city has a flip side. In this regard, it is difficult to deny that Glasgow also has one. Scotland's largest city, for a long time, was known as a city with the worst underworld, a place where politics or business is not the way of accruing power, but fear, violence, and crime. Only a handful of names have made the residents freeze in terror, like Kevin Gerbil Carroll. Violent and cruel in his ways, there are many stories about Kevin, who is considered a demigod of the violent Glasgow gang scene. His rise to the top was remarkable, but his demise was just as spectacular and brutal in image. This is the story of how one person lost his way into violence and commitment to one of the brutal gangland murders in Scotland. Born on August 24, 1980, in Glasgow's Stub Hill Hospital, Kevin Carroll's childhood did little to hint at the man he would become. As a boy, he endured relentless bullying at the hands of two boys, Stephen Lyons and his brother Edward Jr., names that would become hauntingly significant in the future. The Lyons family had deep roots in Glasgow's criminal landscape, but weren't the only ones vying for dominance in the city. There was another major player in town, the Daniel family. Kevin's fortunes change when he builds friendships with the sons of crime boss Jamie Daniel, Robert Daniel, and Francis Fraggle Green. The boys attended the same school, and soon, their bond pulled Kevin into the world of crime. Before long, he was swept up in the feud between the Lyons and Daniel families, a conflict that would shape his destiny and seal his fate. By his late teens, Kevin had become well acquainted with the police, racking up multiple arrests. But petty thefts were just the beginning. By his mid-20s, he had graduated to far more lucrative and violent endeavors. Kevin soon became the enforcer for the Daniel family, and his fearsome reputation grew rapidly. His weapon of choice, fear, his favorite tactic, a horrifying method known in the underworld as alien abduction. The technique was as brutal as it was traumatizing. Kevin and his crew would descend on their target's home, disguised as armed police officers. The victim would be blindfolded, whisked away to a desolate location, and subjected to unspeakable torture. The violence was so extreme that many victims either couldn't remember the events or were too terrified to speak about them. These assaults became known as alien abductions because the targets would reappear seemingly out of nowhere, broken and lost, with no memory of what had happened. The legend of Gerbil grew, and with it, the fear. Kevin Carroll wasn't just an enforcer. He was also heavily involved in Glasgow's drug trade. However, his reputation for ruthlessness extended beyond violence. He was known to double-cross even his associates. He'd sell drugs to dealers only to rob them of the same product hours later. One notorious incident saw Kevin ambushing a dealer who had just purchased 5 kilos of cocaine from him, reclaiming the drugs and keeping the cash. The underworld didn't forget these betrayals, and neither did his enemies. But Kevin's lust for power extended beyond drugs. He had his eyes on weapons, and when he heard about a stolen SA-80 rifle, the British Army's standard-issue firearm, he knew he had to have it. The rifle, complete with an infrared scope and tripod, was worth a fortune. Unfortunately for the Lyons family, they wanted it too. The Lyons had already put down a 4,000-pound deposit for the weapon, but that didn't stop Kevin. He kidnapped the soldier selling the gun, subjected him to his brutal methods, and forced him to hand over both the weapon and the Lyons deposit. The Lyons and Daniels crime families have been having disagreements and vendettas against each other for a long time, and possessions and politicization of people's desires and emotions made it worse. Each mobster dynasty was strong enough to conquer a slice of Glasgow's underworld and spend years expanding their criminal empires in the city. But, as it happened by the summer of 2001, the pressure reached its maximum limit, and so came hard drugs, violence, deception, and sometimes death. But a fierce war for the territory in the city. At the heart of this feud was a simple yet audacious act: the theft of a substantial stash of cocaine belonging to the Daniels family. The drugs had been stored in a house located in Milton, a territory fiercely controlled by the Lyons. In organized crime, where power is maintained through fear and control, the theft was not just a financial loss, but an affront, a direct challenge to the Daniels' authority. For Kevin Gerbil Carroll, the Daniels' infamous enforcer, this was a personal insult, and retaliation was not only necessary, but imminent. Kevin was more than willing to lead the charge against the Lyons. By this time, he had solidified his reputation as a ruthless enforcer who took pleasure in dealing out brutal punishment to those who dared to cross his path. His infamous alien abduction technique had already left countless victims traumatized and fearful, and he was ready to apply the same level of terror to the Lyons family. What followed was a series of escalating acts of violence between the two families, each side determined to assert dominance over the other. The once covert power struggle for control of Glasgow's drug trade erupted into an all-out war, with both sides engaging in increasingly audacious attacks that would shock the city. For the people of Glasgow, especially those living in the north of the city where the Lyons and Daniels held sway, life became a battleground. In any war, casualties are inevitable, and for Kevin Carroll, his role at the forefront of Daniels' retaliation efforts made him a prime target. The Lyons family, having felt the sting of Kevin's violent methods, knew that taking him out would deliver a significant blow to the Daniels' power. As the feud raged, the Lyons began orchestrating their revenge, plotting to rid themselves of their most dangerous enemy. The first attempt on Kevin's life came in 2003, a calculated ambush right outside his mother's home. The details of the attack remain murky, but Kevin was left injured, though not mortally. True to his reputation for survival, he managed to escape with his life. The failure to kill him did little to deter his enemies. If anything, it only increased his paranoia. Kevin was known for being vigilant and always looking for threats, but surviving this first attempt likely hardened him even further, making him more dangerous as he sought retribution. 3 years later, in 2006, Kevin found himself targeted by Lyon once again. This time, it was more than just a brazen drive-by shooting in broad daylight. Kevin and his colleague Ross Sherlock were walking in Bishop Briggs town when suddenly a car pulled up next to them. Shots rang out and chaos ensued. Kevin was shot in the stomach, but his vitality returned and he managed to stop the attack. The injuries were serious but not fatal, and Kevin lived to fight another day. For most people, 2 assassination attempts would have been a wake-up call, a reason to lie low or perhaps reconsider their life choices. But Kevin Carroll wasn't like most people. Each near-death experience only seemed to fuel his insatiable hunger for revenge. He grew more paranoid, always expecting another hit, but he became more unhinged and reckless in his quest to strike back at his enemies. He wasn't just looking to defend himself anymore. He wanted to send a message that no one could touch him. the violence between the Lions and Daniels had reached a fever pitch. Still, the moment that truly pushed the feud into the realm of the unthinkable came as an act that shocked even the hardened members of Glasgow's criminal underworld. In an act of chilling cruelty, Kevin Carroll and his associates allegedly desecrated the grave of Gary Lyons, an 8-year-old boy who had died of leukemia in 1991. Gary was the son of Eddie Lyons Sr., the patriarch of the Lyons family. The desecration of a child's grave is an act so vile, so beyond the pale, that it left even the most battle-hardened gangsters reeling. The gravestone was vandalized an insult to the memory of a young boy who had no part in the violent world his family inhabited. The act was deeply personal and a statement of intent, a message to the Lyons family that the Daniels, especially Kevin Carroll, were willing to go to any lengths in this war, no matter how despicable. This was the final straw for the Lyons. They had already given blood through the loss of loved ones to this war, but what was done to Gary's grave screamed for revenge. Gary's family would have been celebrating his birthday this past week, and many of them were planning to be at the gravesite on Wednesday when the attack happened. The solemnity of fresh earth instead gave way to tearful fury, and in the open hole, they found nothing but anger and grief. What followed was an inevitable escalation in violence. The Lyons were out for blood. Kevin Carroll was their #1 target. The war between the two families was not just about territory or money. It had become deeply personal. Every attack, every act of violence was now driven by the need for revenge, and Kevin, with his volatile nature and penchant for cruelty, was at the center of it all. The violence moved outward and onto the streets, suctioning Glasgow into a whirligig of revenge, followed by another counter-revenge rinse cycle. Each time one side fired, the other would do so immediately after, and casualties began to spiral. The city turned into a war zone, and shootouts, stabbings, or arson attacks soon seemed to be part of day-to-day life on many streets. Kevin Carroll was at the heart of this bloody tit-for-tat warfare. As such, he was reported as a cornerman feared by the Daniel family for their drug empire and turf war. Source: ruthless and indifferent to any measure of consequences, he reveled in the mayhem that ensued between you two. Every violent act, every merciless retaliation, cost Kevin some of his enemies an enemy. The Lyons were not the only ones who wanted him dead. By the time of the second assassination attempt in 2006, Kevin's paranoia was at an all-time high. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, always expecting the next attack. He wore bulletproof vests, traveled with armed associates, and was never far from a weapon. However, Kevin's reckless behavior only made him more vulnerable despite his efforts to protect himself. He was a marked man, and it was only a matter of time before his enemies caught up with him. Violence became a regular part of life for both families, and the feud claimed many lives. One of the most shocking incidents occurred in December 2006 when two Daniel enforcers stormed a car dealership owned by the Lyons family. They opened fire, killing 21-year-old Michael Lyons and wounding several others, including his cousin Stephen. Though the attackers were caught and sentenced to 35 years in prison, the Lyons were not finished. For 4 years, tension simmered until they reached a breaking point on January 13, 2010. Kevin had arranged a meeting in the Asda car park in Robroyston, Glasgow. Seated in the back of a black Audi, he was strangely relaxed. Unarmed and without security, he was uncharacteristically unprepared for what would happen. At 1:23 p.m., a Volkswagen Golf pulled into the car park, boxing in Kevin's Audi. Two men jumped out and immediately began firing into the car. Kevin's two associates seated in the front fled the scene unharmed. Kevin, trapped in the back seat, had no chance. He was hit by 5 bullets, one of which fatally struck him in the head. The attack lasted only 25 seconds, but by the time it was over, Kevin Carroll was dead. He was just 29 years old. The murder of Kevin Gerbil Carroll shocked Glasgow's underworld and the public alike. It was one of the most brazen gangland hits the city had ever seen, carried out in broad daylight in a busy supermarket car park. While the Lyons family was the obvious suspect, rumors soon began circulating that there was more to the story. Police arrested Ross Monahan, a known Lyons associate, but the trial collapsed in 2012. There was insufficient evidence to convict him, with the entire case hinging on a single particle of gunshot residue found on a jacket. The forensic evidence was deemed unreliable, and Monahan walked free. But there was more at play. It was later revealed that a disgraced police officer, Derek McCloy, had been feeding the Lions confidential information about Kevin's whereabouts. McCloy, who was later convicted of drug offenses and breaching the Official Secrets Act, had been deeply embedded in the Lions' criminal operations. His betrayal added yet another layer of intrigue to the case. Even with the Lions family implicated, some in Glasgow's underworld believed that Kevin's death was orchestrated from within the Daniel family itself. Kevin had made plenty of enemies outside and within his circle. His violent tendencies, erratic behavior, and lack of loyalty had alienated many. He had even threatened Jamie Daniel, the head of the family, and had physically assaulted Jamie's daughter Kelly, Kevin's wife. Some speculated that the Daniel family had decided Kevin was too dangerous to keep around. The fact that his associates in the car fled without resistance and that Jamie's brother Francis was on the scene almost immediately after the hit fueled suspicions of an inside job. Had Kevin been set up by the very people he trusted? Kevin Carroll's death in 2010 marked the beginning of the end for his role in Glasgow's bloody gang wars, but it failed to bring the peace many had hoped for. His assassination, carried out in broad daylight while he sat in his car outside an Asda supermarket, was a shocking reminder that the feud between the Lions and the Daniels was far from over. Even though Carroll had been a major player in the conflict, his death did little to stem the tide of violence that continued to engulf the city's criminal underworld. Both families remained locked in a bitter struggle for control over Glasgow's lucrative drug trade, their rivalry as fierce as ever. For those who knew Kevin, his violent death was no surprise. He had lived a life defined by brutality, chaos, and a relentless thirst for power, and in the end, it was violence that claimed him. His passing left a void in the Daniels family's operations, but it also left behind a legacy of fear and destruction. The families of those who had been caught in the crossfire were left to pick up the pieces, their lives forever scarred by the actions of men like Kevin Carroll. Communities that drugs and gang warfare had already ravaged continued to suffer, trapped in a cycle of violence that seemed impossible to break. Kevin Gerbil Carroll's story serves as a grim reminder of the harsh realities of life in Glasgow's underworld, a world where alliances are temporary, betrayal is commonplace, and violence is a constant presence. His death may have closed one chapter in the feud, but the book on Glasgow's gang wars remains open, with new names continuing to rise and fall in its bloody pages.
In 1985, a notorious hitman walked out of his Sydney apartment, got into a police car, and vanished without a trace. His name was Chris Flannery, and he charged $50,000 per kill. This was the beginning of Australia's most mysterious cold case. What happened in those final moments? The official story claims he simply disappeared, but witness accounts tell a different tale. One that involves corrupt police officers, organized crime bosses, and a web of silence that has lasted nearly 4 decades. Brunswick, 1948. A small boy stands in the doorway of a weatherboard house, watching his father stumble down the street one last time. Chris Flannery would never see his alcoholic father again, leaving his mother to work multiple jobs in Melbourne's roughest neighborhood just to keep food on the table. This moment marked the beginning of his tragic transformation. The neighborhood was a breeding ground for violence and crime, where local gangs ruled the corners. Chris quickly gained a reputation as the kid who wouldn't back down, no matter how big his opponent. By 12, he was running with older boys, participating in petty theft and street fights. His mother's pleas fell on deaf ears as he chased quick money and street respect. At 14, Flannery crossed a line that would change his life forever. His first criminal conviction came after a brutal assault on a local shopkeeper who'd accused him of stealing. Instead of showing remorse, Chris smiled throughout his court appearance. The judge, troubled by his behavior, sentenced him to Morningstar Reformatory School. Morningstar would transform this troubled teen into something far more dangerous. Behind its stone walls, guards employed systematic torture under the guise of discipline. Flannery became their primary target, his defiant attitude drawing special attention. In response, he orchestrated an act of rebellion that became legendary, convincing an older inmate to tattoo a massive crucifix across his back. The crude ink job was excruciating, but it served its purpose. The guards couldn't strike him there anymore without damaging their handiwork. Each punishment only hardened his resolve. While other boys crumbled, Flannery emerged stronger, organizing other inmates and manipulating the system to his advantage. The reform school's attempts to rehabilitate him backfired spectacularly. By 19, his escalating violent behavior landed him in Melbourne's notorious Pentridge prison. As he walked through those gates, the guards whispered warnings about the new arrival, but they didn't realize that their warnings were too late. Morningstar had already done its work. The scared young boy who'd watched his father walk away was long gone. In his place stood a young man who'd learned that violence was the only language the world understood. As he was processed into Pentridge's intake unit, a prison psychologist noted his disturbing lack of empathy and potential for extreme violence. Behind those bluestone walls, in the infamous H Division, Chris Flannery was about to receive an education in brutality that would transform him into Australia's most feared hitman. Those bluestone walls held secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Inside H Division, guards wielded absolute power, turning daily life into an endless cycle of physical and psychological torture. When they encountered Chris Flannery's defiant attitude, they saw it as a personal challenge they needed to crush. Inside this concrete fortress, new arrivals faced brutal beating sessions that could last for hours. The guards operated without oversight or restraint, making every day a fresh torment for the inmates. But Flannery refused to submit to their authority. In a shocking act of rebellion, he stripped completely naked and covered himself in his own waste, making it impossible for the guards to handle him. When that didn't stop the beatings, he launched a hunger strike that lasted 28 days. His deteriorating condition and the publicity it generated forced authorities to launch a parliamentary inquiry into conditions within H Division. His brother, Michael Flannery, a respected Melbourne lawyer, helped expose these abuses. He testified about the systematic torture, the arbitrary punishments, and the culture of violence that permeated every corner of the facility. The inquiry revealed horrifying details: inmates being forced to run gauntlets of baton-wielding guards, random midnight beatings, and psychological warfare designed to break even the strongest spirits. But rather than breaking under the pressure, Flannery was studying. Every punch thrown by a guard, every psychological tactic they employed, he absorbed it all. Prison psychologists noted with growing alarm his exceptional ability to compartmentalize violence and his complete absence of normal emotional responses. One report warned that he was developing advanced sociopathic tendencies that could make him extremely dangerous if released. The guards became his unwitting teachers in the art of brutality. They showed him how to inflict maximum pain with minimum effort, how to use fear as a weapon, and how to break someone's spirit through calculated violence. These lessons in brutality would later make him Australia's most feared hitman. As the parliamentary inquiry dragged on, conditions in H Division barely improved. Flannery spent 3 years in this concrete hell, emerging in 1972 as something entirely new. The young criminal who entered Pentridge was gone. In his place stood a man who had mastered the very techniques of brutality that were meant to subdue him. The system had tried to break Chris Flannery. Instead, they created something far more dangerous. As he walked out of Pentridge's gates, he carried with him the scars of his imprisonment and a deadly education in violence that would soon terrorize Australia's criminal underworld. The guards had transformed him, just not as they'd intended. freedom exposed Flannery's stark limitations as a criminal in Australia's underworld. Despite his prison education, he proved remarkably inept at armed robbery, with each attempt ending in humiliating failure. These disasters would eventually drive him toward a far more sinister path that would terrorize the entire country. His robbery attempts read like a comedy of errors. Once, he tripped over his own feet during an escape, scattering stolen money in front of witnesses. In Perth, his getaway car ran out of fuel just blocks from the bank he'd robbed. Each failure only fueled his determination to succeed in crime. Seeking stability, Flannery briefly worked at an upscale men's clothing store in Melbourne. There, he developed his signature taste for Italian designer suits and expensive cologne. But after 2 months, he returned to crime, robbing the same store that employed him. He even paused during the robbery to try on a jacket, as his former boss would later tell police. The defining moment came at Sydney's Central Station. Detective Roger Rogerson and his team had been monitoring Flannery after his string of failed robberies across New South Wales. When Flannery spotted the surveillance team during morning rush hour, he drew his weapon, transforming the busy station into chaos. Trapped between platforms 18 and 19, Flannery unleashed a level of violence that previewed his future notoriety. He charged at the police officers, firing indiscriminately with complete disregard for his safety. It took 6 officers to subdue him, and even then, he fought with such intensity that several needed medical attention. During the arrest, Flannery displayed a shocking savagery that rattled even veteran officers. He seemed to embrace the violence, laughing as police struggled to contain him. One detective called it the most savage resistance arrest in his 20-year career. Back in prison, Flannery made a decision that would alter Australia's criminal landscape forever. In a prison yard conversation with fellow inmate Alan Williams, he announced his new career plan. "I'm done with this amateur stuff. From now on, I'm going to kill people for a living." Williams thought it was a joke until he saw Flannery's cold, determined expression. That conversation marked the emergence of Mr. Rent-a-Kill, Australia's first professional hitman for hire. Flannery had discovered his true criminal calling. The failed robber was about to become the most feared assassin in the country's history. While Melbourne's criminal underworld was filled with tough guys and empty threats, Flannery distinguished himself with a revolutionary business approach, a professional contract killing service with a strict fixed rate payable in advance. After years of failed robberies, he had found his true calling in methodical, calculating murder. His reputation spread quickly through criminal networks as someone who delivered results with cold efficiency. His transformation from bungling thief to feared hitman was cemented with the contract on Melbourne solicitor Roger Wilson. Wilson had made dangerous enemies through his work with police informants, and his elimination would showcase Flannery's trademark precision. Dressed in a police uniform, Flannery approached Wilson outside his suburban home, claiming he needed to discuss a case. The solicitor, accustomed to working with law enforcement, willingly entered the vehicle. By the time Wilson realized his fatal mistake, they were deep in the woods outside Melbourne. What followed demonstrated Flannery's calculated methodology. He systematically wore his target down before executing him with 2 precise shots. The body was buried in the forest, but increasing police activity forced Flannery to relocate it to a site that remains undiscovered despite extensive searches. Wilson's disappearance triggered a major investigation, but potential witnesses had an unsettling habit of vanishing before they could testify. The Wilson murder established Flannery as Melbourne's premier contract killer. Unlike his earlier chaotic robbery attempts, this new profession perfectly suited his methodical nature and prison-hardened instincts. Each successful hit enhanced his reputation, and Melbourne's underworld elite soon recognized that the former failed criminal had found his true expertise: precise, professional elimination. Chris Flannery's home life reveals a man living in perfect balance between two extreme worlds. In their suburban home, he transformed into a devoted family man, pushing his adopted child on playground swings and never missing family dinner, even after the deadliest assignments. His marriage to Kathleen Egan in April 1978 marked an unexpected turning point. Fresh out of prison and already establishing himself as Australia's deadliest hitman, Flannery showed genuine dedication to his new family by adopting Kathleen's child from a previous relationship. Those who knew them witnessed his authentic commitment to domestic life. The feared hitman who made hardened criminals tremble had only one person who could strike fear into his own heart: his wife, Kathleen. "I've got to get home or she'll have my nuts," he'd tell associates when meetings ran late, betraying a mixture of respect and genuine fear for his wife's authority. Between violent assignments, Flannery immersed himself completely in family life, taking elaborate vacations that could stretch for weeks. He'd spend his days playing with his child and attending to domestic duties as if his darker profession didn't exist. But the police surveillance teams documenting his movements knew the truth, watching his seamless transitions between family man and executioner. Their relationship carried an intensity that fascinated observers. Kathleen proved far more than a passive witness to her husband's criminal career. She asked detailed questions about his activities and exercised considerable influence over his decisions. Police eventually suspected she played a significant role in coordinating his criminal enterprises. The surveillance team stationed outside their home witnessed his daily transformations. In the morning, he'd kiss his family goodbye like any suburban father. Hours later, he'd carry out a contract with cold precision. Then he'd return home, change clothes, and help with homework as if nothing had happened. Flannery mastered the art of compartmentalization between his roles as family man and contract killer. He applied the same meticulous attention whether planning an assassination or organizing a family birthday party. At the center stood Kathleen, the only person who truly understood both sides of Australia's most feared hitman, sharing a story that merged domestic devotion with criminal enterprise. Behind the carefully maintained facade of family man lay a predator who could switch from sharing tea with his targets to executing them in cold blood. The Botched murders would become one of the most shocking examples of his ruthless nature. August 13, 1982, started like any other day in suburban Sydney. Drug dealer Terence Basham and his partner Susan Smith welcomed Flannery into their home, completely unaware of his true intentions. He sat calmly with his victims, engaging in pleasant conversation over tea while knowing exactly how their afternoon would end. Without warning, Flannery drew his weapon and executed both Basham and Smith at point-blank range. The clinical precision of the killing showed his evolution into a professional assassin. But his most cruel act was leaving their 2-year-old daughter Sarah alone with her parents' bodies. The next morning, police discovered Sarah hugging the lifeless bodies of her parents, having spent the night alone with their corpses. This image of innocence destroyed by calculated violence would haunt investigators for years to come. The Basham residence had been known for drug activity, but the cold-blooded nature of these murders stood apart. Forensic reports confirmed both victims were shot at close range in what appeared to be carefully planned executions. In the aftermath, Flannery showed no remorse. He began openly bragging about his violent acts, using the Basham murders to build his fearsome reputation in Sydney's criminal underworld. Each retelling seemed to give him pleasure, especially the details others found most disturbing. The Botched murders marked a turning point for Flannery. He embraced a new level of brutality that made him even more valuable to Sydney's criminal elite. As his reputation for ruthless efficiency grew, so did the price for his services, along with the list of potential clients willing to pay for his particular skills. Imagine a city where hitmen advertise their services like businessmen, where murder has a price tag, and where loyalty changes hands with each new contract. Welcome to 1980s Sydney, where Chris Flannery was about to make his mark as Australia's most notorious gun for hire. The city's underworld was already a powder keg of competing interests and violent turf wars. Different criminal factions fought ruthlessly for control of Sydney's lucrative rackets, from illegal gambling to vice operations. Into this volatile mix stepped Flannery, ready to capitalize on the chaos. He positioned himself as a freelance operator, taking contracts from any crime group willing to meet his price. This unusual business model made him both valuable and dangerous. A gun for hire with no true loyalties. His growing cocaine habit began to shape his actions in dangerous ways. Flannery openly bragged about his murders in underworld hangouts, treating each death like another item on his resume. This reckless behavior marked him as different from the old-school criminals who preferred to operate in shadows. His disregard for traditional criminal hierarchies and police authority reached new heights when he reportedly told a high-ranking police officer, "You're not an endangered species." The threat was clear. In Flannery's world, everyone was a potential target if the price was right. This attitude earned him fear and respect in equal measure, but it also made him increasingly unpredictable. The cocaine-fueled paranoia began affecting his judgment. Where once he'd been calculating and methodical, he now took unnecessary risks. He'd switch allegiances on a whim, working for rival gangs sometimes within the same week. In Sydney's underworld, where loyalty was currency, Flannery's mercenary approach marked him as a wild card that no one could fully trust. As gang wars erupted across Sydney, Flannery found himself in constant demand. Each faction wanted the feared Mr. Rent-a-Kill on their side, but none could be sure he wouldn't work for their enemies tomorrow. He'd become a deadly free agent in a city where taking sides was traditionally how criminals survived. This unusual position made him valuable, but also increasingly isolated. By 1985, both corrupt police and rival gangsters were beginning to see Flannery as a major liability. His cocaine-addled boasting and erratic behavior threatened the delicate balance of power in Sydney's criminal ecosystem. The once disciplined hitman who transformed murder into a business was spiraling into dangerous territory, seemingly blind to the consequences of his actions. Flannery's cocaine-fueled spiral had already made him dangerous, but his next move would shock even Sydney's most hardened criminals. When Detective Michael Drury refused a bribe, Flannery unleashed a violence that would destroy the delicate balance between law and crime. Detective Drury had been investigating a drug case that threatened to expose connections between corrupt police and Sydney's criminal underground. The syndicate, following their usual playbook, sent corrupt officer Roger Rogerson to offer Drury a bribe. But Drury stood firm, refusing the money and setting off a chain of events that would change everything. The syndicate saw Drury's refusal as a direct threat to their operation. They needed someone to handle the situation, and Chris Flannery stepped forward with a solution that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. On June 6, 1984, as Detective Drury prepared dinner in his kitchen with his 2-year-old daughter nearby, gunshots shattered his kitchen window. The bullet struck Drury, but he survived and identified Flannery as the shooter. This attack on a police officer violated an unspoken rule that even the most ruthless criminals respected. The shooting created a seismic shift in Sydney's underworld. While corruption and bribery were business as usual, attempting to murder a police officer threatened the very system that allowed organized crime to operate. Both law enforcement and criminals recoiled at this breach of their unwritten code. His connection to the shooting through Roger Rogerson exposed the corruption within the police force. When Rogerson was later dismissed for misconduct, Flannery lost his protective shield within law enforcement. Flannery's position became increasingly precarious. To corrupt police officers, he represented a dangerous loose end who knew too much. To the criminal underworld, he was now a liability who had broken their most sacred rule. His paranoid behavior only amplified the danger he posed to both sides. The failed assassination of Detective Drury marked Flannery's point of no return. He had transformed from a valuable asset into a threat that neither criminals nor corrupt police could afford to ignore. His erratic behavior and intimate knowledge of both worlds' secrets sealed his fate in Sydney's underworld. Just months after shooting Detective Drury, Flannery faced a terrifying machine gun attack on his home that would send him spiraling into madness. That January morning, bullets tore through his walls, and though he escaped with his life, his grip on reality began to slip away. The attack pushed him deeper into cocaine addiction, with Flannery consuming the drug up to 20 times daily while battling severe sleep deprivation. Police surveillance teams watched as Australia's most methodical hitman unraveled before their eyes. Flannery stayed awake for weeks at a time, his appearance deteriorating as he bounced between safe houses. The deadly mix of cocaine and exhaustion twisted his mind, convincing him that corrupt police and rival gangsters were closing in from all sides. His fears weren't completely imaginary. As Sydney's premier hitman, Flannery carried dangerous secrets about the criminal underworld and its connections to law enforcement. He made it clear, if anyone tried to take him out, he'd expose everything he knew about the bodies buried across Sydney, both literally and figuratively. In his cocaine-fueled paranoia, Flannery began writing lists of targets, former allies, police officers, and criminal associates he believed were plotting against him. His behavior grew more erratic by the day. Surveillance teams observed him taking random detours, studying reflections, and constantly checking for followers. The criminal underworld watched with alarm as their once reliable killer transformed into an unpredictable threat. His detailed knowledge of corrupt police operations and organized crime made him too dangerous to ignore. Every day brought new signs that Flannery was losing his grip, and by May 1985, both criminals and law enforcement had reached the same conclusion. The man who knew too much had to be silenced. Sydney's most professional hitman had become a target himself. In the underworld, an unstable man armed with explosive secrets can only survive for so long. As Flannery's paranoia reached its peak, the hunter was about to become the hunted. As Flannery's grip on sanity weakened, his body count kept rising. The turning point came with his most shocking murder yet, the assassination of someone who had completely trusted him. This final contract would reveal just how far Flannery had fallen into his deadly spiral. On April 23, 1985, Tony Spaghetti Eustace walked out of the airport Hilton in North Arncliffe. 6 bullets tore through his back as he approached his gold Mercedes, a brutal execution of someone Flannery once called friend. 2 schoolchildren discovered Eustace bleeding beside his car, marking another chilling chapter in Sydney's underworld violence. The murder of Eustace sent tremors through Sydney's criminal circles. Flannery had eliminated his closest associate in the Sydney underworld, sending an unmistakable message that shattered what remained of the underground's trust in their most effective killer. Police files attributed at least 15 murders to Flannery, though investigators suspected many more. His deadly efficiency had served Sydney's criminal elite well until now. The same skills that made him valuable had become a liability as his behavior grew more erratic. After killing Eustace, Flannery began threatening to expose everyone's secrets if he faced arrest for shooting Detective Drury. These weren't empty threats. They came from someone who knew the darkest details about Sydney's most powerful criminals. The underworld's response was swift. In hushed meetings across Sydney, crime bosses reached their verdict. Flannery had to be eliminated. The hitman who commanded $50,000 per kill now found himself targeted by his former employers. Flannery sensed the walls closing in. He darted between safe houses, fueled by cocaine and paranoia, compiling an ever-growing list of enemies on both sides of the law. The very skills that had made him Sydney's most feared assassin now made him its most hunted man. As May 9, 1985 approached, Sydney's criminal empire prepared to turn its deadly machinery against its most effective killer. The man known as Mr. Rent-a-Kill was about to face his own brutal methods firsthand. On the morning Chris Flannery vanished, 4 police officers, 1 broken-down car, and a mysterious urgent meeting created the perfect trap. The stage was set for Sydney's most feared hitman to meet his end. The morning of May 9, 1985, began with a phone call from George Freeman. Sydney's most powerful crime boss had an urgent matter to discuss. When Flannery tried to start his car, the engine wouldn't turn over, a mechanical failure that should have triggered his notorious paranoia. He called Freeman to explain, but Freeman insisted he take a taxi. The urgency in Freeman's voice overpowered any suspicion in Flannery's cocaine-addled mind. As he waited outside the Connaught building, 2 police officers he knew pulled up alongside him. They offered him a ride, and despite his recent paranoia about conspiracies against him, Flannery got in. The car moved through Sydney's morning traffic until it stopped at a red light. 2 more police officers appeared and entered the back seat. In an instant, Flannery found himself surrounded. The car pulled away from the traffic light and disappeared into the Sydney morning. Somewhere between that moment and whatever happened next, Australia's most notorious hitman vanished forever. The timing was deliberate. Just weeks after threatening to expose corrupt police officers and criminal organizations, after compiling lists of targets, after the murder of his friend Tony Eustace, Flannery had sealed his fate. The criminal empire he had served so efficiently had decided he was too dangerous to keep alive. As that car disappeared into the Sydney traffic, it took with it Chris Flannery and countless underworld secrets that would never see the light of day. No body was ever found. No witness ever came forward. The man who had charged $50,000 per kill had become another missing piece in Sydney's dark criminal puzzle. For 5 years, the disappearance of Australia's most notorious hitman gripped Sydney, launching one of the city's largest criminal investigations. As detectives worked to uncover the truth, they faced a daunting challenge: investigating a murder where every potential witness and suspect was deeply embedded in the criminal underworld. The coronial inquest interviewed over 400 witnesses, but each new testimony only deepened the mystery. Key suspects offered contradicting stories or refused to talk altogether, while others provided accounts that led investigators down endless dead ends. The search for Flannery's body became an obsession, with police scouring properties across Sydney from remote bushland to urban construction sites. But like many of his own victims, Flannery's remains were never found. A breakthrough came from Nettie Smith, a prominent underworld figure who placed Flannery in a police car with officers he knew on the day he vanished. Other witnesses corroborated this crucial detail, adding weight to suspicions about police involvement. The investigation repeatedly returned to crime boss George Freeman's house, where multiple accounts suggested Flannery met his end. But Freeman, like many others connected to the case, died without revealing what he knew. Years later, multiple sources identified Stan Smith as Flannery's likely killer, one professional hitman eliminating another in an operation that left no evidence behind. The coroner ultimately concluded that Flannery was murdered by person or persons unknown on May 9, 1985. Former detective Roger Rogerson held crucial pieces of the puzzle, but maintained his silence, leaving key questions unanswered. The investigation exposed Sydney's intricate criminal network, where the boundaries between law enforcement and organized crime had dissolved. In this shadowy world, even Australia's most feared hitman could vanish without a trace. His disappearance a stark reminder of a system designed to keep its darkest secrets buried forever. Chris Flannery's disappearance marked a decisive moment in Australian organized crime, restoring a delicate balance among rival factions that his unpredictable behavior had threatened to destroy. His elimination removed a major liability, allowing criminal enterprises to operate with reduced internal conflict. Nearly 4 decades later, his body remains unfound, making him the final victim in his own deadly game. The unresolved nature of his case continues to cast a long shadow over Australian criminal history, highlighting the complex relationship between organized crime and law enforcement during the 1980s. His story stands as a dark chapter in Australia's criminal underworld, a ruthless hitman whose violent end matched the brutal world he inhabited.